It's like Resident Evil meets Sesame Street. It's like Resident Evil meets Sesame Street. It's like Resident Evil meets Sesame Street. Have you heard that My Friendly Neighborhood is like Resident Evil meets Sesame Street? Because I sure have. Probably way too many times. Not that I'm gonna deny that it is a pretty accurate description for the game. You see, My Friendly Neighborhood is kind of like if you took Resident Evil and set it in Sesame Street. Okay, I'll stop. But seriously, the execution of this game is actually pretty well done. It's not perfect by any means, but it delivers on that proposal pretty well. You see, indie horror games can sometimes get a bad rap for being full of shovelware, and mascot horror games really amp that reputation up to 11. If you haven't heard the term mascot horror before, it's usually referring to a small subset of indie horror games that share a few key qualities. You've got bright colors, cutesy monsters, ear-blasting jump scares, and a heavy focus on appealing to children. Some prime examples of mascot horror games include Five Nights at Freddy's, Bendy and the Ink Machine, Baldi's Basics, Garden of Banban, Choo Choo Charles, and a whole bunch of other games riding the same wave. Not to say that all these games are terrible, I mean I haven't played most of them myself, but it's undeniable that their success hinges mostly on marketing to children. And we all know kids. They aren't exactly media critics, so a lot of these games are massive money printers despite having some of the worst gameplay imaginable. And again, maybe Five Nights at Freddy's 13 is a masterpiece or something, but that doesn't change the fact that the genre has become nearly synonymous with terrible games. So why am I doing a video on My Friendly Neighborhood, you ask? I mean, it does match most of the points I just listed. Bright colors? Check. Cutesy monsters? Check. Huge appeal to children? Check and check. But there's one big difference between My Friendly Neighborhood and the vast majority of the mascot horror genre. It's actually good? If you've played any classic survival horror games, almost everything you'd expect from those is present in My Friendly Neighborhood. We've got item boxes, inventory Tetris, limited resources, branching paths, arbitrary puzzles, and tons of backtracking. Heck, they even took that classic zombie burning mechanic in the form of taping up puppets you've downed so that they don't get back up when you return to the room. I had a pretty good time exploring all the nooks and crannies of the big interconnected map and blasting some overly chatty puppets along the way. The game does a pretty good job of replicating all those old game mechanics in a new format. However, beyond the nostalgia factor, it's kind of clear why some of these game mechanics fell out of favor over time. One issue I took with the design was how there's basically a loading door around every corner. But the loading screens aren't long, and the game runs very well, even in the larger, more open areas. Plus, there are doors that don't have loading screens attached, and it's not like they break the game or anything. But you never know if a door will trigger a loading screen until you actually interact with it. So many times I caught myself thinking, I just wasted a bunch of ammo downing these enemies, do I really want to test this door and have that all go to waste? Which leads me to believe the loading screen doors were added for two main reasons. The first being the obvious nostalgia factor. Old games did it, so why don't we do it too? But the more important reason the levels are designed this way is that they force you to plan around enemy placements. However, even in a classic survival horror game I won't name, the zombies stay dead when you first kill them, until a much later point in the game. In My Friendly Neighborhood, if you're not planning to use your very limited tape on an enemy, it's almost always better to just run around them instead of engaging. There's just no good reason to waste resources on enemies that can be easily avoided and instantly respawn when you leave the room. And I wouldn't even mind the doors that much if they weren't interrupting the game every 30 seconds or so, with the random exception of some big areas that just don't have them. And while I'm listing off some minor cons, I guess I should mention that the puppets have a pretty wild grab range. It's clear that they don't want you to use the wrench much, but getting grabbed from 10 feet away just feels wrong. However, don't let small issues like that take away from the big picture here. Overall, I had a pretty good time playing through the 4 to 5 hour campaign on survival mode. Moving on, as you can probably tell by now, the visuals are solid throughout. It's not amazing or anything, but they executed pretty well on their desired style. There's a few highlights that stood out to me, like the retro soundstage and the Art Deco office building, while some other areas like the garden felt a little more rushed. And like many horror games before it, My Friendly Neighborhood is decently front-loaded. in that the early levels are the most intricately designed and fun to experience. They definitely put a lot of effort into the first few levels, but maybe they decided to expand the game a little more on the tail end of development. I don't fault them for this, but it does cause the game to lose a bit of steam in the back half, especially when one of the later chapters is basically just a backtracking world tour. And while the quality of some levels may vary over time, the voice acting remains consistently excellent throughout the whole game.
Oh, that wasn't pleasant. I'm gonna take a sec.
It's possibly some of the best voice acting I've heard from any small budget indie game. The constant chatter from the puppets is somehow annoying, humorous, and consistently memorable all at once.
Now you have one hand inside your stomach and one outside.
Make a
This is
big,
the best
big
part.
And the sock puppet character who acts as a guide throughout the story is actually very well done. They provide not only a little bit of comedy, but some unexpected emotions throughout.
Oh, silly me. I forgot about the elevators. Really, Gordon, I wouldn't bother.
And of course, I can't forget the main character, who sounds exactly like Bob Hoskins from the 1993 Super Mario Bros. Movie.
Lady, we're looking for somebody, and we're from Brooklyn.
All I could imagine while playing this game was a gruff, grumpy Mario begrudgingly making his way through hordes of monsters just to do his job.
Okay. I'm here to disconnect the...
And you even end up doing a little bit of plumbing in the game, so I'm really wondering if the old Mario Brothers movie was an inspiration, at least in some small way.
We're from Brooklyn.
But really, all the voice acting is top notch, so huge props to everyone who contributed to this. I could go on about the story or the lessons behind the narrative, but I think I've already said enough. If you enjoy classic survival horror in an indie format, I think this game would be right up your alley. I'm definitely interested to see more from these developers in the future, but what I'm even more interested in is seeing how this impacts indie horror games in general. You'd have a hard time getting a Five Nights at Freddy's kid to play Silent Hill, but show them My Friendly Neighborhood and you could easily bridge that gap to other survival horror. Speaking of which, this video is sponsored by, well, me, I guess? I mean, this video isn't actually sponsored, but I am making a survival horror game myself. If you've seen my past videos, you've probably heard this plenty of times by now, but for everybody new, I'm making an occult survival horror game set in a desolate gas station in the middle of the desert. It's got all those classic survival horror tropes everyone loves, you know, cryptic puzzles, limited resources, branching paths, and a whole lot of demon fighting action. It's called Ad Infernum, and it's actually getting pretty close to done. If all goes well, I should have it out this year after a long multi-year development process. If you had a headline for the game, you could call it Resident Evil meets Sesame Street. Or, you know, actually scratch that. Yeah, I was lying about not mentioning Resident Evil anymore, sue me. Anyways, if you're interested, I'll leave a link to wishlist it down below. But if you'd rather stay on YouTube, why not check out a couple of my past videos? I cover all sorts of games with quite a lot of indie horror mixed in. No pressure though, you do you. Regardless, I've got some new video ideas I want to get started on, so until next time, have a good one, folks.
Glad you asked. When I'm feeling happy, I eat watermelon. When I'm sad, I eat lemon. When I'm confused, I eat the roadkill outside. When I'm angry, I feast upon the tears of my enemies. When I'm smart, I eat everyone else's food.